You're listening to the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. So let's start with the first one, Jehan. Let's talk about the great Australian teams and players over the eras and generations.
Yeah.
And let's discuss, Australia's dominant period, which really put them on the world stage as the best team in the world. So Jehan, what are your memories of growing up watching Australian teams of the 90s and early 2000s? Such many great players and many good teams that went on to do good things.
Yeah, I mean, they were a great team. They won all over the world in Test cricket. They won World Cups 3 in a row, Champions trophies. They were the number one team in all forms of cricket. I sort of caught Australia when I first started getting into cricket towards the end of the Taylor period, so sort of mid to late 90s. And I think at the time they had a really good side, and they were really starting to dominate and play well all over the world. But then from 99 onwards, when Steve Waugh took over, I think he took that team from being a very good team to a great team. And he instilled this confidence in the team whereby they were able to just dominate any opposition. And it was great to watch. I think, they were sort of briefly compared to what the All Blacks did in rugby union. It was a great team. Probably the early 2000s under Steve Waugh is what I look back fondly on. They had a number of great players in that team. Obviously, you have to have great players, but some of the best that ever played the game. So, yeah, really good memories from that period.
Yes, absolutely. The likes of Steve Waugh, and you had McGrath, Warne, you had Hayden, Langer, Gilchrist, Lee, that dominated that period. And
there wasn't a weak link in that side, really.
No, there wasn't. They all had their all different skills and talents that they provided in the 11, and that showcased on the field. To win 16 Test matches in a row is a proud achievement. Did that twice, obviously under Steve Waugh the first time, and then Ricky Ponting when he took over the captaincy from Steve Waugh. And to do that twice, it just shows how good of a team they were. Obviously, the current day team has a lot of great players as well. You have Smith, you have Cummins, Stark, Lyon, Hazelwood, David Warner, when he was in his pomp, was very dominant. So the current day team has been a very good team itself and building its own legacy and that. No doubt we'll talk about that a bit later on in this episode. But what are your thoughts on the modern day team, Jehan? There's been a lot of talk about them being better than the other teams before, as we've just mentioned, with Steve Waugh and then Taylor, and then before that was Alan Border and etc. Do you think that this team is better than the team of the early 2000s, late 90s under Waugh and Taylor, or do you think different time, different era, different generation of players?
Look, I don't think they definitely haven't reached the heights of those teams of the late 90s and 2000s. Probably, I mean, they're a very good team. They've won a lot around the world. Still struggling to win a series in England and India, which are the two countries that they've struggled in overseas. They've been described as a nearly team, so they've done a lot of really good things, but I don't think they've quite reached the heights of even that Mark Taylor team of the late 90s. So, and I would say there's probably been a few. If you compare both the teams of both of those eras, I think you could say that there's probably been a few weak links in this side. I mean, if you look at the batting, for a long time, it was basically held up by Steve Smith and David Warner, and then when they were both banned for a year, the batting seemed to collapse a fair bit. They've built a really good bowling attack. All four of those bowlers together, I think, are the only 4 bowlers to have all taken over 200 wickets whilst playing in the same side. But I suppose they haven't quite managed to do it overseas. In particular, as I said, England and India, because those are the main ones that you'd be looking to win as a side.
Yes, they did talk about that and said it was a legacy-defining sort of year. Tour of India, Tour of England didn't quite go to plan.
Yeah,
And we will touch on those failures overseas in a moment in this episode. But Jehan, just to finish off about great teams and great players in Australian cricket, who do you think is the best player of this? How would you put it? Who would you think was the most influential player or players in Australian cricket in this period of time in their dominance? Obviously, under Taylor, and then Steve Waugh, and then obviously this current generation now with Pat Cummins at the helm. Who do you think has been the most influential player of those different eras?
So if we're talking about the Taylor and Waugh era, I would have to say definitely Shane Warne. He'd be number 1 in that list. Shane Warne, Glenn McGrath, the Waugh twins, Ricky Ponting, Adam Gilchrist. Starting to name the whole side here, but I think those would be the most influential players that have just allowed Australia to win all over the world against all opposition, home and away. So those are the players I'd really mention from that era. In the current generation, we have, who's Steve Smith, also known as the modern day Bradman. So I'd have to say, Steve Smith, David Warner, and then all 4 bowlers. I don't really think you could leave one of those out. Definitely Pat Cummins. He averages 21 or something ridiculous in Test cricket. So Pat Cummins, I didn't realise that Stark's record was as good as it has been. So I'd have to put Stark in there as well. And obviously Nathan Lyon's the best spinner that we've had since Shane Warne. So I suppose, with me naming those players in this current generation, there's only 2 batsmen that I've named there. So there have been weak links. They haven't had a full sort of dominating batting lineup. In recent years, Marnus Labuschagne and Travis Head have come into the side and slightly strengthened that. Usman Khawaja, over a whole career, I don't think really lived up to expectations until this very sort of final part of his career. I guess those are the differences when you compare the 2 eras. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, well, it's very hard to compare eras. Because the game was vastly different in different times and eras and generations. But Australian cricket's been blessed to have many good players in its history. You were going to say something, Gio?
I was going to say this is probably one of the best bowling attacks that Australia's had for a long time, with 3 quality fast bowlers and a spinner. In terms of numbers, you could probably compare Pat Cummins to McGrath in terms of averages. Nathan Lyon has been a very good spinner. He was never going to be as good as Shane Warne. But I think back to the 90s, and there were periods where Australia used to play 2 spinners quite often. Shane Warne and Tim May used to play together.
And Stuart McGill. As well.
So you'd have one great fast bowler in McGrath, and then you'd have a Gillespie or a Fleming with the 2 spinners. But this current era, it's always been the 3 fast bowlers and spinner. So I think that's been the strength of this side. Probably where they have let themselves down, it's been the batting, really. particularly overseas.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And hi, everyone. Hope you enjoyed listening to Jehan and I discuss the great Australian cricket teams and players. If you're listening to this episode of the podcast on our YouTube channel, let us know in the comments some of your great Australian cricket teams and players. We would love to hear what you have to say.